Behind the gilded gates and marble corridors of Britain's most prestigious palaces lie collections that speak volumes about the private lives of monarchs. From priceless art to curious trinkets, some possessions reveal obsessions, some comfort, and some secrets long hidden from the public eye. Tonight, we'll wander quietly through these storied collections, uncovering the items that tell us as much about the royals as their crowns, robes, and titles ever could. Before we begin this journey through royal collections, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, not just for more stories, but because the royal curtain doesn't lift without a little help. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and allow the pace to slow. And while you're here, feel free to leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. Is it early in the evening, Manchester? Middle of the night in Tampa? Or somewhere in between? We greatly appreciate your company during these quiet hours. Now let's begin. Number 23. Queen Mary I, 1516 to 1558. Queen Mary I, often remembered for her turbulent reign and her nickname Bloody Mary, carried with her a fascination for religious devotion that extended into the very objects she treasured. Among her many possessions were religious relics, devotional artifacts, and meticulously preserved manuscripts, each a reflection of her deep faith and her desire to maintain a tangible connection to the spiritual world. In an era when religion dictated the course of politics and personal life, Mary's collections were not mere decoration. They were extensions of her identity, a sanctuary amid the relentless pressures of monarchy. Mary's devotion to collecting these sacred items was intense. She maintained careful inventories of her relics, ensuring each artifact was catalogued, stored, and preserved in a manner befitting its spiritual significance. From intricately decorated reliquaries to illuminated manuscripts, each object told a story of devotion, ritual, or royal patronage. These collections were also politically symbolic, reinforcing her commitment to Catholicism at a time of intense religious upheaval in England. Owning and displaying these sacred items demonstrated both her piety and her authority, subtly reminding her court and her people of her religious legitimacy. What makes Mary's collecting particularly fascinating is the contrast between her personal reverence and her public persona. While history often emphasizes the fear she inspired through her enforcement of religious policy, her collections reveal a quieter, more introspective side, a queen seeking comfort, stability, and connection through the objects that mattered most to her. Each piece in her collection was chosen with care, preserved with attention, and imbued with personal significance. An intimate window into the mind of a monarch navigating the turbulent waters of 16th century England. In exploring these collections, we begin to understand that Queen Mary's life was as much about curating meaning and memory as it was about ruling. Her hoarding of devotional items was not mere obsession. It was a reflection of her inner world, a way of holding on to stability and faith amid a realm often defined by chaos and conflict. Number 22. King James I, 1566 to 1625. King James I, ascending to the English throne in 1603 after Elizabeth I, is often remembered for his scholarly pursuits and his role in shaping the early Stuart monarchy. Beyond politics and governance, James harbored a passionate interest in collecting books, manuscripts, and royal artifacts, amassing one of the most remarkable private libraries of his time. His collections were not only a reflection of personal curiosity, but also a tool for influence, demonstrating erudition, wealth, and cultivated taste to courtiers and foreign dignitaries alike. James's love of books and manuscripts was all-encompassing. From theological treatises to classical literature, he surrounded himself with volumes that fed both his intellect and his fascination with the mystical and political. Royal decrees, historical accounts, and works on philosophy and science found their way into his carefully curated collection. This obsession, extended to royal artifacts and ceremonial items, which were preserved meticulously within the palaces, creating a tangible archive of history, tradition, and prestige. These treasures were often catalogued, inventoried, and displayed to emphasize the continuity and authority of the monarchy. The king's collecting habits reveal a man deeply engaged with the legacy he inherited and the image he projected. While James faced criticism for his sometimes extravagant court and personal excesses, his collections underscore a more reflective, contemplative side. In a period when rulers were expected to embody both power and sophistication, James's library and artifact troves provided a quiet testament to his intellectual pursuits, cultural influence, and personal passions. Exploring these collections offers a glimpse into how King James balanced the demands of ruling with a profound love of knowledge. His careful preservation of manuscripts and artifacts illustrates a desire to maintain continuity, to honor the past, and to shape the cultural heritage that would be inherited by future generations. These items, treasured and catalogued with precision, reveal a monarch whose mind and curiosities extended far beyond the political arena, reminding us that behind the crown were very human interests, passions, and obsessions. Number 21. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, 1763 to 1827. Prince Frederick, the second son of King George III, is often remembered for his military career and his leadership during the Napoleonic Wars. Yet behind the uniform and ceremonial duties lay a man with a passionate obsession for collecting military regalia, documents, and artifacts. His dedication to preserving these items went far beyond casual interest. It reflected a deep desire to honor tradition, commemorate victories, and assert a sense of order amid the often chaotic world of warfare and royal expectations. Frederick's collections were extensive. They included uniforms, medals, weaponry, and detailed military maps, each carefully preserved to illustrate both historical achievements and his personal engagement with the army he commanded. He also maintained volumes of correspondence, reports, and official documents, catalogued meticulously to ensure that no piece of military history or royal involvement was lost. This hoarding of artifacts served a dual purpose. It satisfied his personal inclination toward meticulousness while creating a historical record that would reflect well on the monarchy and its association with leadership, duty, and valor. What makes Frederick's collecting particularly intriguing is the blend of personal and public significance. While some items were purely for study or personal satisfaction, others were intended to impress or inform, showing visitors and contemporaries a curated image of discipline, legacy, and refinement. His careful attention to storage, labeling, and preservation illustrates a mind attuned to order, detail, and historical legacy, revealing a quieter side to a figure often remembered for public failures and courtly frustrations. Exploring the Duke of York's collections offers a window into a royal life where obsession and duty intertwined, where personal interests became intertwined with public legacy. Through these preserved artifacts and documents, we glimpse a prince whose meticulous attention to detail and desire to chronicle history created a lasting impression far beyond the battlefield. The objects he treasured, organized, and safeguarded whisper stories of a man seeking stability, meaning, and recognition in both his personal and public life. Number 20. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, 1900 to 2002. Queen Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, led a life marked by longevity, public service, and a deep appreciation for the tangible reminders of history and family. Beyond her public duties, she developed a lifelong passion for collecting jewelry, royal gifts, keepsakes, and mementos, often preserving items of personal and historical significance with meticulous care. Her collections were more than decorative. They were a living archive of royal life across the 20th century, spanning decades of social change, war, and public attention. From inherited pieces to carefully chosen gifts, the Queen Mother amassed items that reflected both personal milestones and the monarchy's broader legacy. Jewellery, in particular, held a special place, not merely for its beauty, but for its symbolic connection to family, tradition, and national identity. She also collected ceremonial objects, photographs, and letters, cataloguing them in a manner that allowed her to maintain a coherent record of her life and the lives of those closest to her. Each item in her possession carried stories, memories, and lessons from decades of royal experience. What sets her collections apart is the balance between personal sentiment and historical importance. Many objects were treasured privately, providing comfort and continuity amid the pressures of public life. Others served as visual reminders of events, people, and places that shaped modern Britain, creating a bridge between private reflection and public narrative. The Queen Mother's dedication to preservation reveals a keen awareness of the power of memory, the role of objects in storytelling, and the importance of safeguarding legacy for future generations. Exploring the Queen Mother's collections allows us to witness a royal life defined not just by duty and ceremony, but by intimate connections to history and family. Her hoarding of keepsakes and royal artifacts was not eccentricity for its own sake, but a reflection of her enduring love for tradition, careful attention to detail, and reverence for the stories these objects could tell. Through them, we gain a richer understanding of the humanity, sentiment, and continuity behind one of Britain's most beloved royals. Number 19. Prince John, 1905 to 1909. Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, lived a life largely hidden from public view. Yet his private world was filled with fascination, curiosity, and a remarkable collection of personal items. Due to his health challenges and epilepsy, John was largely kept at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, where he developed a deep attachment to his surroundings and the objects within them. His passion for collecting toys, books, and nature specimens became a defining part of his daily life, offering both comfort and a sense of control in a life constrained by illness. From a very young age, John exhibited a keen interest in books and educational materials, often amassing volumes that explored animals, science, and fairy tales. His personal library grew carefully, each book treasured and well used. Alongside literature, John gathered toys, small artifacts, and natural specimens, ranging from insects to shells, reflecting both his curiosity and his need for tactile engagement. These collections were catalogued and arranged meticulously, providing him with a private world full of discovery, learning, and imagination. What makes Prince John's collecting particularly poignant is the blend of innocence, intellect, and isolation. While his siblings lived lives exposed to the court and public ceremonies, John's treasures provided a personal refuge, a way to engage with the broader world safely and meaningfully. Each item carried not only fascination, but also emotional significance, allowing him to navigate the challenges of his young life with comfort and curiosity. Exploring Prince John's collections offers a rare glimpse into a royal childhood shaped by health struggles, seclusion, and the solace of possessions. Though often overlooked in historical narratives, his hoarding and careful curation reveal a mind deeply attuned to learning, discovery, and the personal value of objects. Through his toys, books, and specimens, we witness a young prince cultivating a world uniquely his own, finding joy, order, and fascination amid the constraints of royal life. Number 18. King Henry VIII, 1491 to 1547. King Henry VIII, one of England's most famous monarchs, is often remembered for his 6 marriages and sweeping religious reforms. But beneath his commanding presence lay a fascination with collecting objects of opulence and prestige. From armoury and armour to tapestries, jewellery, and lavish furniture, Henry's collections were a reflection of his power, wealth, and personal tastes, as well as a way to display his dominance and sophistication to both his court and foreign dignitaries. Henry's hoarding habits were extensive and meticulously managed. He commissioned elaborate tapestries and armour not only for practical use, but to demonstrate the grandeur of his reign. His personal chambers, often filled with richly decorated furnishings, were a testament to his desire for comfort, status, and visual impressiveness. Jewellery and precious stones were collected both for adornment and as symbols of authority, each item carefully catalogued and often displayed to impress visitors. These objects reinforced the image of a monarch whose rule was as much about spectacle as governance. What makes Henry's collecting particularly intriguing is the intersection of personal desire and political messaging. His acquisitions were never purely decorative. Each piece served a purpose, whether to assert dominance over nobles, impress foreign ambassadors, or commemorate victories. Even his armour collections, stored in elaborate halls, communicated strength, preparation, and martial prowess, blending personal passion with public image. Exploring King Henry's hoarding offers a glimpse into a monarch for whom objects were extensions of identity, power, and ambition. His attention to detail, investment in lavish items, and preservation of prized possessions reveal a ruler deeply conscious of legacy, one who sought to craft an enduring impression through both deeds and artifacts. Through his carefully curated collections, we see a man whose fascination with grandeur and authority shaped the material culture of Tudor England, leaving a legacy that continues to captivate historians and the public alike. Number 17. Queen Anne, 1665 to 1714. Queen Anne, the last monarch of the Stuart dynasty, is often remembered for her political acumen and the union of England and Scotland. Yet her personal life reveals a deep fascination with collecting documents, gifts, and personal artifacts. Despite chronic health struggles and a turbulent personal life, Anne meticulously amassed political papers, letters, and gifts from allies and dignitaries, treating them not merely as possessions, but as touchstones of influence, memory, and connection. Anne's hoarding habits were defined by attention to detail and careful preservation. She catalogued correspondence from her ministers and political allies, ensuring that every decree, opinion, or note could be referenced when needed. Gifts from foreign courts and domestic supporters were similarly treasured, often stored and displayed with thoughtful care, demonstrating both gratitude and a keen understanding of symbolic power. Her collections reflected the dual nature of her reign. Personal sentiment intertwined with political significance. What sets Queen Anne apart is the blend of personal attachment and strategic purpose. While many items provided comfort or memento, others served as reminders of alliances, obligations, and loyalties within her court. In an era when monarchy was deeply intertwined with public perception, Anne's collections were not just private indulgences, they were subtle instruments of influence, allowing her to navigate the complexities of governance while maintaining personal stability. Exploring her amassed treasures offers insight into a queen whose reign was shaped as much by careful attention to detail as by political strategy. Each letter, gift, and document in her collection tells a story of relationships maintained, decisions weighed, and a monarchy preserved amid challenges. Queen Anne's hoarding illuminates a human side of leadership, showing how even the most powerful monarchs sought comfort, continuity, and control through the careful curation of objects that mattered deeply to them. Number 16. Prince George IV, 1762 to 1830. Prince George, who later became King George IV, is often remembered for his extravagant lifestyle, flamboyant fashion, and indulgent social life. Yet behind the glittering veneer of the Regency era lay a man with a passionate obsession for collecting art, sculptures, and fashion items. From portraits of European nobility to exquisite furniture and personal garments, George's hoarding habits reflected both personal taste and a desire to curate a world that matched his vision of grandeur. George's collections were extensive and highly specific. He commissioned paintings from renowned artists, acquired sculptures for his palaces, and accumulated luxurious clothing in quantities that astonished even his contemporaries. Each piece was carefully chosen, catalogued, and displayed in a manner that allowed him to project sophistication, wealth, and cultivated taste. Fashion items were not merely worn, they were statements of identity, power, and influence, while his art acquisitions reinforced his position as a patron of culture and refinement. What makes George's collecting particularly fascinating is the interplay between personal indulgence and public image. While he derived personal pleasure from surrounding himself with beauty and luxury, the sheer scale of his collections communicated status and authority to courtiers, foreign dignitaries, and the public alike. Palaces such as Carlton House and later Buckingham Palace became repositories of his tastes and ambitions, turning every room into a testament to his vision of regal elegance. Exploring Prince George's hoarding offers insight into a royal life defined by both aesthetic obsession and the pursuit of legacy. His collections reveal a man who used objects to craft an identity as much as to enjoy personal satisfaction. Through the art, sculpture, and fashion he amassed, we glimpse a monarch for whom the material world was a canvas, a means of expression, and a way to leave an enduring mark on British history. George's passion for collecting, though extravagant, provides a compelling lens into the personal motivations and cultural influence of one of Britain's most flamboyant royals. Number 15. Princess Amelia, 1783 to 1810. Princess Amelia, the youngest daughter of King George III, is often remembered for her quiet demeanour and devoted family life. Yet she harboured a keen interest in collecting letters, personal keepsakes, and small art pieces. In her relatively short life, Amelia found comfort and personal expression through the careful curation of objects that reflected her intimate world. Her hoarding was not ostentatious but deeply personal, revealing a royal who sought solace, memory, and continuity amid the pressures of family, health struggles, and public expectation. Amelia's collections were varied and thoughtfully maintained. She cherished letters from family members, carefully preserving correspondence that documented both ordinary moments and significant events. Small art pieces and mementos, often gifts from relatives or personal acquisitions, filled her private spaces, creating a sanctuary of personal meaning and reflection. Each item carried emotional weight, connecting her to loved ones, important experiences, and cherished memories that offered comfort during times of illness and familial turbulence. What makes Princess Amelia's hoarding particularly poignant is the blend of sentimentality and necessity. Limited in her public engagements due to fragile health, she turned to her collections as a means of engaging with her world. These possessions allowed her to retain a sense of control and personal identity, providing an outlet for emotion and creativity in a life often circumscribed by circumstance. Her careful organization and preservation of letters and keepsakes highlight a meticulous mind and a heart attuned to the significance of memory. Exploring Princess Amelia's collections offers a window into a royal life that balanced intimacy, introspection, and emotional resilience. Through her letters, mementos, and small treasures, we witness a princess who valued the quiet power of objects to connect, comfort, and preserve personal history. Amelia's hoarding was not driven by extravagance, but by a desire to hold on to meaning, leaving behind a subtle yet profound legacy of devotion, care, and personal reflection that illuminates the human side of monarchy. Number 14. Queen Charlotte, 1744 to 1818. Queen Charlotte, consort of King George III, is remembered not only for her influence on the royal family, but also for her passionate interest in collecting botanical specimens and exotic plants. Her fascination with horticulture went far beyond mere decoration. It became a lifelong obsession that shaped the gardens of royal estates and reflected a broader curiosity about nature, science, and beauty. Through her collections, Charlotte cultivated an intimate connection to the natural world, demonstrating how royal taste and personal passion could intertwine in meaningful ways. Charlotte's hoarding extended to a wide variety of plants and botanical specimens, many carefully sourced from abroad. She was known to catalogue, label, and preserve each species with painstaking attention, creating structured gardens and greenhouses that were as much a display of knowledge as of aesthetic elegance. These collections included rare flowers, exotic trees, and medicinal plants, reflecting a deep interest in both the decorative and scientific aspects of horticulture. Each plant was nurtured with care, highlighting her meticulousness and her understanding of the fragility and value of life. What makes Queen Charlotte's collecting particularly fascinating is the intersection of beauty, education, and legacy. Her botanical obsession was not only a personal pursuit, but also a public statement. It demonstrated sophistication, intellectual curiosity, and a connection to the growing scientific interests of the 18th century. By preserving exotic and native species alike, Charlotte contributed to the expansion of botanical knowledge in Britain, creating gardens that were admired by contemporaries and continue to be celebrated today. Exploring Queen Charlotte's passion for plant collection offers a unique perspective on royal hoarding, a blend of obsession, education, and aesthetic sensibility. Her meticulously curated gardens and collections remind us that collecting does not always involve objects or treasures in the traditional sense. Sometimes it is about nurturing life, understanding nature, and leaving a lasting impression through care and dedication. Through her devotion to plants and botanical study, Queen Charlotte reveals the human desire to collect, preserve, and celebrate beauty in all its forms. Number 13. Prince Albert Edward, later Edward VII, 1841 to 1910. Prince Albert Edward, who would later ascend the throne as King Edward VII, is often remembered for his charm, social presence, and indulgent lifestyle. Beyond the public persona, he harbored a deep passion for collecting gifts from foreign dignitaries, mementos, and objets d'art, creating an impressive and eclectic private collection. These items were not merely ornamental. They reflected his keen eye for aesthetics, personal taste, and fascination with cultural diversity from across Europe and beyond. Albert Edward's collections were as varied as they were extensive. From exquisite jewellery and clocks to ceremonial gifts and decorative objects, he amassed items that symbolised relationships, diplomacy, and personal achievement. Each piece was carefully preserved and catalogued, reflecting his meticulous approach to curating both personal and historical significance. Many items also served as conversation pieces, displayed strategically in his residences to impress visitors and reflect his sophistication, cultural knowledge, and status within European royalty. What makes Albert Edward's collecting particularly interesting is the blend of personal enjoyment and public messaging. While some objects were treasured privately for their beauty or sentimental value, others communicated connections, influence, and prestige. His hoarding was thus a subtle extension of his role in the monarchy, intertwining personal pleasure with the cultivation of an image that resonated with both domestic and international audiences. Exploring Albert Edward's collections offers a window into a royal life where curation, display, and personal obsession intersected. Through his gifts, mementos, and objets d'art, we see a prince navigating the responsibilities of royalty while indulging in the human desire to collect, preserve, and celebrate the tangible traces of life, culture, and achievement. His collections reveal a monarch deeply attuned to the aesthetic and symbolic power of objects, leaving a legacy of elegance, taste, and enduring fascination for historians and enthusiasts alike. Number 12. Princess Victoria, Duchess of Kent, 1786 to 1861. Princess Victoria, Duchess of Kent, mother of Queen Victoria, led a life shaped by both maternal devotion and a fascination with collecting personal letters, jewellery, and treasured artifacts. Her hoarding habits were deeply intertwined with her desire to maintain control, security, and connection in a life often dominated by court politics and the upbringing of a future queen. Each item she preserved was more than a possession. It was a tangible link to her family, her past, and the legacy she sought to pass on to her daughter. The Duchess's collections were extensive and meticulously maintained. Personal correspondence, gifts, and keepsakes from friends and family were catalogued with care, ensuring that every object retained its story and significance. Jewellery and small decorative items were particularly treasured, often stored in secure locations and handled with great care. Through these possessions, Princess Victoria could create a sense of order and continuity, maintaining her personal world in a manner that balanced sentimentality with structured preservation. What makes her hoarding especially fascinating is the blend of maternal purpose and personal obsession. While some items were clearly chosen for their beauty or rarity, many were preserved for their emotional and familial significance. This careful curation allowed her to safeguard memories, maintain a sense of identity, and provide a stable foundation for Queen Victoria, who would later become one of Britain's most influential monarchs. Exploring Princess Victoria's collections offers insight into the inner world of a royal figure, balancing personal passion with duty and foresight. Her hoarding was not an eccentric indulgence. It was a deliberate and thoughtful effort to maintain connection, memory, and influence within the royal family. Through her letters, jewellery, and cherished artefacts, the Duchess of Kent leaves behind a portrait of a woman who understood the power of objects to preserve history, foster relationships, and shape legacy, reminding us that even the most private collections can carry enduring significance. Number 11. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, 1619 to 1682. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, famed military commander, admiral, and cousin to King Charles I, was as renowned for his daring on the battlefield as for his passionate collecting of military trophies, art, and curiosities. Beyond the glories of war, Rupert's private life revealed a man captivated by the tangible remnants of history, culture, and achievement. Each item he amassed reflected both personal pride and the broader cultural fascination with collecting that defined European aristocracy in the 17th century. Rupert's hoarding included weaponry, armour, medals, and military relics, acquired through campaigns, personal triumphs, or diplomatic gifts. These objects were not simply stored. They were catalogued meticulously and displayed to illustrate his achievements and to inspire admiration from peers and visitors. Beyond martial artifacts, Rupert also amassed paintings, scientific instruments, and curiosities, items that revealed a keen intellectual curiosity and appreciation for artistry. His collections created a private world in which he could engage with history, science, and aesthetics, all while reinforcing his personal identity as a man of courage, taste, and refinement. What makes Prince Rupert's collecting particularly intriguing is the dual nature of his obsession. On one hand, it was a personal endeavour, satisfying his fascination with the world and the spoils of life. On the other, it was deeply performative. His hoarding communicated prestige, intellect, and power to those around him. Every trophy, painting, or curiosity served as a statement about his place in the royal and military hierarchy, showcasing accomplishments in both battle and culture. Exploring Prince Rupert's collections offers insight into a royal whose life intertwined action, intellect, and passion for preservation. His dedication to collecting and cataloguing objects illustrates a desire to leave a tangible record of achievement, to understand and organize the world around him, and to engage both himself and others with history's enduring artifacts. Through his carefully curated hoard, we gain a glimpse into the mind of a prince who combined martial skill with intellectual curiosity, leaving a lasting impression far beyond the battlefield. Number 10. King William IV, 1765 to 1837. King William IV, often remembered as the Sailor King for his long naval career, also harboured a fascination with nautical instruments and naval memorabilia that reflected both his personal history and his love for the sea. unlike many monarchs whose hoarding was driven by aesthetic taste or diplomacy. William's collecting stemmed from practical experience, sentiment, and a desire to preserve the tangible reminders of his life at sea. These objects became an extension of his identity, offering both comfort and a link to his formative experiences. William amassed an array of maritime artifacts, including navigational tools, ship models, charts, and personal items salvaged or acquired during his naval service. Each piece was carefully preserved, catalogued, and displayed in private quarters, serving as both mementos and educational tools. Through his collections, William could reflect on past voyages, strategic successes, and personal memories, while sharing aspects of his maritime world with visitors and family. His hoarding was not merely sentimental, it also demonstrated a disciplined approach to preserving knowledge and history for posterity. What sets King William's collecting apart is the intertwining of personal passion and professional legacy. Unlike some royals who focused on art, jewellery, or gifts, William's hoarding revealed a life shaped by action, adventure, and hands-on experience. Each instrument, model, or chart represented skill, memory, and achievement, allowing him to curate a tangible record of his contributions to Britain's naval history. It was a collection rooted in life experience, combining pride, nostalgia, and historical awareness. Exploring William IV's collections offers insight into a monarch whose interests went beyond palace politics and public ceremonies. His hoarding reflects a desire to preserve experience, educate others, and maintain connection with a world that shaped him profoundly. Through his meticulous curation of naval artifacts, William leaves a legacy that intertwines personal history with national narrative, revealing how even the most practical objects can carry deep meaning and provide insight into the passions and character of a British royal. Number 9. Queen Alexandra, 1844 to 1925. Queen Alexandra, consort of King Edward VII, is remembered for her elegance, philanthropy, and keen eye for collecting art, antiques, and decorative items. Her passion for acquiring and preserving objects extended beyond mere adornment. It reflected a deep appreciation for beauty, history, and craftsmanship. Alexandra's hoarding habits transformed Buckingham Palace into a repository of cultural treasures, demonstrating both personal taste and a commitment to curating a visual legacy for the monarchy. Alexandra's collections were extensive and carefully curated. She amassed paintings, sculptures, fine furniture, and decorative objects from across Europe, often commissioning pieces or acquiring them during royal visits abroad. Jewellery and ceremonial items also held a prominent place, blending personal indulgence with symbolic value. Each acquisition was thoughtfully catalogued and displayed, reflecting her meticulous nature and her desire to maintain a coherent and aesthetically harmonious environment within royal residences. What makes Queen Alexandra's collecting particularly fascinating is the blend of personal taste, public presentation, and historical awareness. While some objects were clearly for private enjoyment, others communicated cultural sophistication and refinement to visitors, dignitaries, and family. Alexandra's collection served as both a personal refuge and a subtle instrument of influence, showcasing the monarchy's connection to art, tradition, and international elegance. Her attention to detail and dedication to preserving objects of value allowed her to craft an enduring visual narrative of the royal household. Exploring Queen Alexandra's hoarding habits offers insight into a royal life anchored in beauty, legacy, and careful curation. Her devotion to art and antiques reveals a personality attuned to both personal enjoyment and the power of objects to communicate status, taste, and cultural appreciation. Through her extensive collections, Alexandra demonstrates how the act of collecting can become a meaningful expression of identity, influence, and historical consciousness, leaving a tangible legacy that continues to inform our understanding of the monarchy's aesthetic and cultural priorities. Number 8. King Edward VII, 1841 to 1910. King Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria, was renowned for his charisma, social presence, and love of luxury. Beyond his public image as a fashionable and indulgent monarch, Edward harbored a passionate obsession with collecting jewelry, clocks, furniture, and gifts from across Europe, creating one of the most lavish private royal collections of his era. His hoarding reflected a blend of personal taste, diplomatic awareness, and a desire to surround himself with objects that symbolized prestige and refinement. Edward's collections were vast and meticulously organized. Jewelry, from brooches to rings and ceremonial adornments, held both aesthetic and sentimental value, often gifted by foreign dignitaries or family members. Clocks and other decorative objects filled his residences, demonstrating his fascination with craftsmanship, innovation, and elegance. Furniture, art, and personal mementos were also acquired in abundance, creating interiors that reflected not only wealth but a careful curation of style and historical significance. What makes Edward's hoarding particularly interesting is the interplay between personal indulgence and public diplomacy. Many items were displayed strategically, serving as symbols of international relationships, royal sophistication, and cultural knowledge. His collections were a reflection of both personality and position. Edward collected for personal enjoyment, but also to project influence and authority, using objects as tools of visual communication within the royal sphere. Exploring King Edward VII's collections provides insight into a monarch for whom collecting was a serious and meaningful pursuit. His passion for jewelry, decorative arts, and gifts illustrates a desire to preserve beauty, memory, and status, leaving behind a curated legacy that highlighted both taste and power. Through these possessions, Edward offers a vivid example of how the act of collecting can combine personal pleasure with public messaging, enriching our understanding of the material culture and social dynamics of early 20th century British royalty. Number 7. Prince George, Duke of Kent, 1902 to 1942. Prince George, the fourth son of King George V, is often remembered for his military service and tragic early death. But he also had a keen interest in hoarding royal memorabilia, documents, and personal mementos. Unlike some royals whose collecting focused on art or luxury items, George's obsession revolved around preserving records and artifacts that connected him to his family, history, and public life. His collections offered a private window into the life of a royal navigating duty, personal interests, and a rapidly changing world. The Duke's hoarding encompassed letters, photographs, official documents, and keepsakes from family members and significant events. Each item was catalogued and carefully stored, reflecting his meticulous nature and desire for organization. Through these preserved objects, George maintained a tangible connection to both personal experiences and the broader narrative of the monarchy, ensuring that moments of history and family life were recorded and safeguarded for future generations. What makes Prince George's collecting particularly notable is the blend of personal sentiment and historical preservation. While some items held private or emotional significance, others reflected an awareness of legacy and the importance of documenting royal life. His dedication to collecting and preserving memorabilia provided a structured, almost archival approach to hoarding, transforming personal passion into a means of chronicling and understanding the monarchy's story. Exploring the Duke of Kent's collections gives insight into a royal whose hoarding was both personal and purposeful. Through letters, photographs, and mementos, he maintained a connection to family, history, and identity. His collections reveal a thoughtful and reflective individual who valued memory, tradition, and the preservation of personal and public heritage. Prince George's passion for collecting illustrates how even in the modern era, royals have sought to create continuity, safeguard history, and find meaning through the careful curation of objects, leaving a legacy that is both intimate and historically significant. Number 6. King Charles II, 1630 to 1685. King Charles II, often remembered as the Merry Monarch, is famed for restoring the monarchy after the English Civil War and for his lively court. Yet he also had a passionate inclination for collecting art, curiosities, and exotic items brought back from the colonies. Charles's hoarding reflected both personal fascination and the broader cultural trend of European aristocracy, where monarchs sought to curate treasures that demonstrated wealth, sophistication, and global connections. Charles's collections were remarkably diverse. He acquired paintings, sculptures, scientific instruments, and natural curiosities, ranging from exotic shells and minerals to unique artifacts from overseas territories. Each item was carefully catalogued and displayed in his palaces, creating spaces that were as much museums as private residences. These collections served multiple purposes: personal enjoyment, intellectual curiosity, and subtle political messaging. By surrounding himself with rare and unusual objects, Charles communicated the breadth of his influence and the cosmopolitan nature of his court. What sets Charles's hoarding apart is the blend of pleasure, prestige, and public perception. While many items delighted him personally, they also impressed visiting dignitaries and courtiers, reinforcing the monarchy's image as cultured, worldly, and powerful. His collections bridged personal desire with social strategy, illustrating how hoarding could serve as both a personal indulgence and a public statement. Exploring King Charles II's collections provides insight into a monarch whose love of beauty, curiosity, and cultural significance shaped his royal identity. His dedication to amassing art and exotic treasures reveals a man who understood the symbolic and aesthetic value of objects, using them to craft both a private sanctuary and a public persona. Through his eclectic and expansive collections, Charles II leaves a legacy of indulgence, intellectual curiosity, and strategic display, demonstrating that even in the glittering court of Restoration England, the act of collecting could be a window into personality, ambition, and taste. Number 5. Queen Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. Queen Elizabeth I, the iconic monarch of the Elizabethan era, is celebrated for her intelligence, political acumen, and cultural influence. Beyond her public image as a shrewd and commanding ruler, she harbored a passionate dedication to collecting jewelry, clothing, and manuscripts, turning her personal possessions into both instruments of display and private indulgence. Elizabeth's hoarding reflected a careful balance of personal taste, political strategy, and the desire to control her image in a world where perception was as powerful as authority. Elizabeth amassed elaborate jewelry, intricately designed garments, and rare manuscripts, each chosen for its beauty, rarity, or symbolic meaning. Her clothing and adornments were carefully curated to convey authority, sophistication, and the mystique of the Virgin Queen, while manuscripts and letters allowed her to preserve knowledge, culture, and political correspondence. These collections were not merely personal indulgences, they were tools of influence, reinforcing her status and showcasing the wealth and refinement of her court. What makes Elizabeth's hoarding particularly notable is the strategic use of objects to manage power and perception. Her possessions served as visual narratives, illustrating her education, alliances, and taste, and projecting an image that balanced strength, elegance, and cultivated intelligence. Each item reflected thoughtfulness, intention, and an awareness of the symbolic weight of material culture in courtly and international politics. Exploring Queen Elizabeth's collections offers insight into a monarch for whom collecting was both personal and political. Her jewelry, clothing, and manuscripts reveal a woman deeply attuned to the power of objects to communicate identity, status, and intellect. Through her careful curation, Elizabeth I demonstrates how hoarding can transcend mere accumulation, becoming a means to shape legacy, influence perception, and leave a lasting impression of sophistication, authority, and cultural significance that endures centuries later. Number 4. King James I, 1566 to 1625. King James I, the monarch who united the crowns of Scotland and England, is often remembered for his literary contributions and political ambitions. Beyond his public persona, James harboured a remarkable passion for collecting books, manuscripts, and royal artifacts, creating one of the most significant private collections of his time. His hoarding reflected not just intellectual curiosity, but also a desire to assert authority, preserve knowledge, and solidify his legacy as both a scholar and a sovereign. James's collections were extensive and meticulously organised. He amassed rare manuscripts, historical documents, and books covering law, theology, science, and literature, many of which were annotated or catalogued personally. These collections allowed him to engage with ideas across disciplines and centuries, demonstrating a monarch whose curiosity and learning were as formidable as his political power. Beyond books, James collected coins, medals, and royal relics, preserving objects that symbolize lineage, prestige, and cultural heritage. What makes King James's hoarding particularly fascinating is the intersection of scholarship and sovereignty. His collections were both tools of knowledge and instruments of influence. By surrounding himself with rare and authoritative works, he reinforced his image as a learned and capable ruler, while also ensuring that future generations would recognize the intellectual depth of his reign. Each item reflected thought, purpose, and the broader mission of cultural and historical preservation. Exploring James I's collections offers insight into a monarch for whom hoarding was not mere indulgence, but a deliberate strategy to curate power, knowledge, and legacy. Through books, manuscripts, and royal artifacts, he created a tangible record of intellect, taste, and historical awareness. His collections reveal a ruler who valued the preservation of ideas, the importance of memory, and the enduring impact of material culture. King James I's dedication to collecting provides a window into how royal hoarding can serve as both a personal pursuit and a tool for shaping perception, authority, and historical significance. Number 3. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, 1763 to 1827. Prince Frederick, the second son of King George III, is often remembered for his military career and reform efforts in the British Army, but he also had a marked obsession with collecting military regalia, documents, and artifacts. Frederick's hoarding was deeply tied to his sense of duty, historical awareness, and desire to preserve the legacy of Britain's military traditions. Each item he amassed reflected both personal interest and professional significance, offering insight into the life of a prince dedicated to service and heritage. The Duke's collections included uniforms, medals, weapons, and military records, as well as maps, strategic plans, and correspondence detailing past campaigns. These objects were meticulously organised, catalogued, and often displayed in private chambers, allowing Frederick to maintain a tangible connection to the history and evolution of the army he commanded. Beyond their symbolic value, these collections served as reference points for education, strategy, and personal reflection, highlighting the intellectual rigour behind his apparent obsession with military memorabilia. What makes Prince Frederick's hoarding particularly notable is the blend of personal pride, professional duty, and historical preservation. Unlike collectors who sought purely aesthetic pleasure, Frederick's passion for military artifacts reflected a desire to honour achievements, understand historical precedent, and create a record of institutional memory. His careful attention to detail ensured that the significance of each item was maintained, transforming his private collection into an organised archive of martial history. Exploring the Duke of York's collections provides a glimpse into a royal whose hoarding went beyond indulgence. Through military regalia, documents, and artifacts, Frederick reveals a dedication to knowledge, legacy, and national heritage, using his private pursuits to complement public service. His collections illustrate how the act of collecting can combine personal interest, historical consciousness, and professional purpose, leaving a legacy that enriches both royal history and the broader understanding of Britain's military past. Number 2. Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, 1900 to 2002. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, mother of Queen Elizabeth II, is remembered for her resilience, charm, and lifelong dedication to the monarchy. Beyond her public persona, she had a remarkable passion for collecting jewellery, royal gifts, and personal keepsakes, a practice that spanned her long life and reflected both sentimentality and a love for history. Her hoarding was not merely indulgent, it served as a means to preserve memories, family legacy, and the tangible traces of a royal life well lived. The Queen Mother's collections were extensive. She amassed jewellery from various eras, ceremonial gifts, portraits, and personal mementos, many of which held deep emotional or historical significance. Each item was catalogued carefully, ensuring its preservation and accessibility for both private enjoyment and future royal generations. Her jewellery in particular was notable not only for its beauty, but for its symbolic value, representing marriages, alliances, and milestones within the royal family. Similarly, other keepsakes chronicle decades of royal history, offering a personal perspective on events that shaped the 20th century. What makes the Queen Mother's collecting especially fascinating is the blend of personal sentiment, historical awareness, and public duty. Her hoarding reflected a desire to maintain connection with family and the broader narrative of the monarchy, while simultaneously curating objects that reinforce tradition and continuity. Each artifact carried a story, bridging the private and public spheres in a way that only a royal of her stature could achieve. Exploring Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother's collections provides insight into a woman who understood the power of objects to preserve memory, honour legacy, and convey status. Her lifelong dedication to collecting illustrates how hoarding can transcend mere accumulation, becoming an act of curation, reflection, and historical preservation. Through her jewellery, gifts, and keepsakes, the Queen Mother left behind a tangible record of her life, family, and the enduring influence of the monarchy, a legacy that continues to inspire fascination and admiration today. Number 1. Prince John, 1905 to 1909. Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, is a poignant figure in British royal history. Afflicted with epilepsy and largely kept out of the public eye, John's short life was spent mostly at Sandringham, under the care of devoted nurses and his family. Despite his isolation, he developed a passion for collecting toys, books, and nature specimens, creating a world of fascination and comfort that reflected both his curiosity and the tender care surrounding him. John's hoarding included miniature toys, puzzles, illustrated books, and small animal specimens, which he organised meticulously. These objects offered both entertainment and education, allowing him to explore, learn, and engage with the world on his own terms. Each item held emotional significance, providing companionship, stimulation, and a sense of control in a life constrained by illness. Through his collections, Prince John cultivated a personal sanctuary that blended innocence, intellect, and imagination, leaving an enduring mark on those who knew him. What makes Prince John's hoarding particularly moving is the intersection of childhood wonder and royal circumstance. While other royals collected to display status, preserve history, or assert identity, John's passion was intensely personal and introspective. Each toy or book became a treasured object, offering a means of expression and exploration in a world largely hidden from public view. His collections reflected a quiet resilience and a love for discovery that transcended the limitations of his short life. Exploring Prince John's hoarding provides insight into the life of a young royal whose passions, curiosity, and imagination were preserved through objects. His meticulous care for his toys, books, and nature specimens offers a window into a world shaped by both privilege and constraint, revealing a tender and human side of monarchy, often overshadowed by public spectacle. Prince John's collections remind us that even in the smallest or quietest corners of royal history, the act of collecting can serve as a source of comfort, identity, and enduring legacy. What began as a desire to collect and accumulate did not always remain confined to objects. In this next section, we see how that same restless impulse found new outlets, turning from hoarded treasures toward more unusual and personal addictions. Behind the gilded gates and marble corridors of Britain's most prestigious palaces lies a truth that no royal biography dares to whisper. For centuries, the monarchy has been built on an image of unwavering composure, divine right, and moral superiority. But what happens when that carefully constructed facade begins to crack? What secrets hide behind the ceremonial robes and jeweled crowns? Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtains on 30 British royals whose private struggles were far more complex than their public personas ever revealed. These weren't scandals that made headlines or gossip that filled drawing rooms. These were quiet dependencies, hidden compulsions, and secret rituals that shaped the very foundation of the British crown. From medieval kings who couldn't sleep without their mysterious elixirs, to modern princes whose medicine cabinets told stories their press secretaries never dared to share. We're about to explore the shadow side of royalty, the side where divine right met human weakness, where absolute power couldn't conquer personal demons, and where the weight of the crown became too heavy to bear without help. Before we begin this journey through royal secrets, take a moment to settle in. Perhaps dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and prepare yourself for revelations that have been buried in palace archives for generations. And while you're here, let us know where in the world you're listening from. Are you drifting off to sleep in London, staying up late in New York, or somewhere in between? Drop a comment and tell us what time it is where you are. This isn't just a story about addiction. It's a story about the impossible burden of perfection, the crushing weight of expectation, and the very human need to find relief from a life lived entirely in the spotlight. Because when you're born into a role that demands you never show weakness, never admit struggle, and never appear anything less than divine, where do you turn when the pressure becomes unbearable? Our first royal understood this burden all too well. King George IV wasn't just the flamboyant Prince Regent known for his architectural vanity projects and expanding waistlines. He was a man quietly unravelling under the weight of a daily chemical contract that would make a modern addiction specialist pale with concern. George wasn't addicted to power or grandeur, though he certainly enjoyed both. He was addicted to the substances that made him feel capable of wielding that power. Chief among these was laudanum, the 19th century's answer to everything that ailed the human spirit. Toothache, melancholy, heartbreak, gout, existential dread, the crushing boredom of court life. Laudanum promised relief from it all. But George didn't approach this miracle cure with the cautious respect of his subjects. He consumed it like a man who had forgotten where the line between medicine and dependency was supposed to be drawn. His relationship with alcohol was equally complex. Wine, brandy, punch, gin, if it could numb either his physical pain or his psychological torment, George embraced it with the enthusiasm of a man drowning who had just been thrown a rope. His personal wine cellar required its own staff, not because he was a connoisseur, but because his consumption had become its own full-time occupation. What makes George's story particularly haunting isn't just the scale of his dependency, but how thoroughly it was hidden behind a mirror-polished image. Official portraits showed him as a romantic figure of royal strength, despite the reality that he had ballooned to over 20 stone and couldn't climb stairs without assistance. Court painters literally airbrushed his deteriorating condition into historical fiction. Public appearances were choreographed with military precision, kept brief and often supplemented with carefully worded statements about minor ailments and necessary rest. One physician, in a letter that wasn't meant for public consumption, described the king's liver as resembling a small turkey and his digestive system as fundamentally unfit for governing an empire. The psychological roots of George's spiral remain a subject of historical debate. Some point to his disastrous political marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, a union that felt more like diplomatic hostage-taking than romantic partnership. Others cite the death of his beloved daughter, Princess Charlotte, as the turning point when grief became too heavy to carry without chemical assistance. All palace insiders who later broke their silence described managing George's condition as a constant balancing act. Mood swings followed by hours of trembling silence. Physicians administering additional tonics to counteract the effects of previous medications, creating feedback loops of dependence that grew stronger with each passing year. It was the royal version of showing up hungover to your own life, day after day, decade after decade. Yet somehow, the public never quite saw the full picture. George IV was marketed as a symbol of stability and national grandeur, even as he stumbled through his final years, both literally and metaphorically. When he died, newspapers reported his passing with the reverence reserved for gods. No mention of the bottles, the pills, the quiet collapses behind silk curtains. The myth of royal invincibility endured, clean and untouchable. But George wasn't alone in this carefully managed deception. His great-grandson would inherit not just the throne, but a remarkably similar relationship with substances that promised relief from the unbearable weight of royal expectation. King Edward VII brought his own unique approach to managing the impossible demands of monarchy. If George IV masked his addictions behind velvet and portraiture, Edward VII camouflaged his dependencies with charm. The kind of irresistible charisma that made people forget to look too closely at what you were doing with your other hand, where your money was going, or exactly how many cigars you had consumed before breakfast. Edward spent 6 decades as the Prince of Wales, effectively waiting for his mother, Queen Victoria, to die. She didn't cooperate with his timeline, leaving him with too much time, too much money, and far too few meaningful responsibilities. This combination proved catastrophic for a man with an already compulsive personality and access to unlimited resources. His 2 great weaknesses were gambling and tobacco, though calling them weaknesses hardly captures the scale of his involvement. Edward reportedly smoked 12 to 20 cigars daily, not including his cigarette breaks. Court records describe cigars being imported, cut, and stored according to his exact specifications, treated with the same reverence other royals reserved for crown jewels. These cigars became his companions in meetings, carriages, meals, and eventually on his deathbed. They were also his armor, a constant assertion of control in a world where he controlled almost nothing else. Certainly not his mother's political decisions, or the constitutional limitations that kept him perpetually waiting in the wings. Gambling provided a different kind of escape, less constant, but far more explosive in its consequences. Edward wasn't a cautious bettor. He lost enormous sums in Parisian casinos, Monte Carlo backrooms, and aristocratic drawing rooms across Europe. One of his most notorious losses involved a private baccarat game that became a full-blown scandal when details leaked to the press. British newspapers delicately danced around the specifics, using phrases like unseemly conduct and inappropriate associations. But the truth, revealed by biographers decades later, was that Edward's presence had violated every protocol of royal neutrality while compromising friends and lending royal credibility to activities that would have landed ordinary citizens in prison. Yet somehow, none of this damaged his public image. Edward possessed what society politely called a hearty appetite for life, which served as elegant code for someone who overindulged in everything while maintaining the good sense to tip generously. His vices became amusing anecdotes rather than serious concerns, testament to either his exceptional public relations skills or his friends' remarkable loyalty in keeping secrets. Behind the scenes, Palace staff worked frantically to manage the practical consequences of his habits. Private letters reveal mild panic about public appearances, mostly due to the smoke that clung to his clothes and the gambling debts that arrived regularly in the mail. One royal servant complained that his cigars had invaded every fabric in the palace, from drapes to diplomatic correspondence, but no one dared confront him directly. By the time Edward finally ascended to the throne at age 59, he was already wheezing from decades of tobacco abuse. His 9-year reign was marked by diplomatic success, but his body bore the unmistakable signs of his private battles. Even so, he maintained his image as the Grand Conciliator, a king who understood both courts and casinos, who could charm any room before the smoke cleared. His addictions were never officially acknowledged, but they surfaced eventually in memoirs and court gossip. They never quite managed to tarnish his legacy, because Edward had mastered something his predecessors had not. He made vice look like sophisticated leisure, transforming personal weakness into public charm. But the pattern didn't end with Edward's death. His son would bring yet another variation to the theme of royal dependency, one that was quieter, more methodical, and ultimately just as destructive. King George V approached his dependencies with the methodical precision of a naval officer executing orders. Where his father Edward had smoked with theatrical flair, George consumed cigarettes like a man fulfilling a sacred duty. Up to 20 a day, sometimes more, not as recreation but as a tool he relied on to navigate the treacherous waters of 20th century monarchy. This wasn't the casual smoking of a social butterfly, or the rebellious gesture of a young prince testing boundaries. George's relationship with tobacco was clinical, almost ritualistic. In his personal correspondence, there are glimpses of a man who lit cigarettes not to celebrate, but to endure. Endure meetings with increasingly demanding prime ministers. Endure the suffocating silence of state ceremonies. Endure the unbearable weight of presiding over an empire that was slowly, inexorably falling apart. Unlike his father's flamboyant displays of excess, George's dependence was internalized, systematic, deeply habitual. Photographs from the era show his fingers positioned in that familiar gesture even when no cigarette is visible, as if his body had memorized the ritual long before his mind consciously reached for relief. Court physicians noticed the pattern, as did his household staff, but the public remained blissfully unaware. Early 20th century royal publicity was a carefully orchestrated machine, and King George V was marketed as the embodiment of unwavering stability. Newspapers praised his austere virtue and iron discipline, even as royal doctors quietly managed his worsening bronchitis, emphysema, and chronic throat inflammation. When illness threatened to topple the king, as it did repeatedly throughout the 1920s and 30s, official statements spoke of minor ailments and brief recoveries. Meanwhile, George was receiving oxygen treatments behind palace doors, struggling with laboured breathing, and being injected with stimulants just to remain upright during state functions. According to diaries later released by royal staff, his morning routine began with tea, a cigarette, and profound silence. A kind of secular communion for a monarch who outwardly controlled everything but privately controlled nothing. He ruled over a collapsing empire, a family torn apart by revolution and exile, and subjects who were rapidly losing patience with crowns and ceremony. His addiction wasn't flamboyant rebellion or scandalous secret. It was quiet collapse, a daily compromise with reality. One more cigarette to survive one more briefing, one more appearance, one more moment of pretending that everything remained under control. When George died in 1936, his passing was officially attributed to lung complications, though the exact circumstances were carefully edited for public consumption. His physician famously administered a final injection of morphine and cocaine, not to save the king, but to ensure he died punctually for the morning newspapers. Even in death, the performance mattered more than the person. The man who had inhaled his way through 2 world wars and imperial dissolution had to exit on schedule, with dignity, and preferably without coughing. His addiction was never acknowledged by the monarchy, but the evidence lingered in every yellowed fingertip, every rasping breath, every hollowed lung that told the true story of his reign. His legacy became one of steadfast duty and unwavering service. But those who looked closely could see the real cost of that carefully maintained image in every exhale, every pause between words, every moment when the king's composure flickered just enough to reveal the man beneath the crown. George's son would inherit more than just the throne. The anxious, stammering George VI would also inherit his father's reliance on smoke and spirits. Only this time, the anxiety wasn't just inherited. It was visible, audible, and eventually fatal. In the pantheon of reluctant monarchs, George VI stands tragically alone, remembered not for his natural gifts but for the visible, almost painful effort required to perform royalty at all. History celebrates him as the stammering king who found his voice just in time to rally a nation through its darkest hour. But behind that heroic narrative was a man so consumed by anxiety that he turned to 2 faithful companions he could always depend on for relief. Alcohol and cigarettes weren't indulgences for George. They were medical necessities. From childhood, he had been the overlooked spare, the second son with uncertain speech raised in the towering shadow of his charismatic older brother Edward. No one, including George himself, expected him to wear the crown. When Edward abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, George was thrust into a role he never wanted and arguably never should have inherited. He coped the only way he knew how, through rigid ritual, careful restraint, and quietly escalating dependence on substances that dulled the sharp edges of royal responsibility. The cigarette habit began early and intensified with alarming speed. By his 30s, George was consuming more than a pack daily. By his 40s, that number had doubled. His staff, loyal to the royal script of perfection, filtered his public image with surgical precision, never showing the ashtrays that followed him from room to room, or the nervous pacing that preceded major speeches. Photographs were selected to conceal how thin he had grown, how grey his complexion had become, how sunken his eyes appeared during state functions. If monarchy was performance, George VI was a stagehand who never escaped the spotlight, always acting, never comfortable, perpetually aware of his own inadequacy. Then there was the drinking. Unlike his predecessors who consumed alcohol with ceremony or celebration, George drank quietly, consistently, with increasing frequency as the pressures mounted. His preferred spirit was gin, though he wasn't particularly selective. Alcohol served as social lubrication, helping him navigate the unbearable stiffness of court protocol and somehow survive the speeches that terrified him more than any enemy bombardment. Former staff members later recalled how he would take a measured drink before radio broadcasts, then chain smoke through his recovery from the ordeal. This wasn't about pleasure or even relaxation. It was pure survival, chemical assistance for a man trying to fulfill a role that seemed designed to destroy him. Royal physicians noticed his deteriorating condition, naturally, but they approached the subject with characteristic delicacy, offering euphemisms and half measures instead of honest medical intervention. His health began failing in the 1940s, but public statements insisted he was recovering, resting, engaged in light duties. The truth painted a much starker picture of a man slowly suffocating under combined pressure from expectation and the poisons he used to meet those expectations. In 1951, he underwent surgery for lung cancer, though the word cancer was never officially uttered in public statements. The operation removed part of his left lung, but George resumed his duties almost immediately, wrapped in scarves, flanked by concerned staff, smiling through obvious pain. That same year, he appeared at London's airport to bid farewell to his daughter Elizabeth, who was departing on what would become a defining royal tour. It was the last time father and daughter would see each other. George died in his sleep in 1952 at the age of 56, a king worn down by war, anxiety, and decades of carefully managed self-medication. The official cause was coronary thrombosis, medical language that politely avoided mentioning a body systematically poisoned by stress, tobacco, and the profound silence that surrounded his suffering. The nation mourned a beloved, steady monarch, but few understood the true cost of that steadiness. He had inherited a throne he never desired, endured a voice that betrayed him at every crucial moment, and turned to quiet chemical companions to bridge the impossible gap between duty and humanity. In death as in life, the mask of royal dignity remained perfectly intact, concealing the man who had needed help just to breathe, just to speak, just to survive another day wearing a crown that never quite fit. Yet even in death, George's mask of dignity couldn't fully conceal the truth that would echo through the generations. Because just across the palace corridors, another royal was already discovering her own path to quiet chemical comfort. The Queen Mother, with her pearls as permanent as her composure, and a handbag that seemed to carry nothing but royal decorum, was crafting a dependency so elegant it would be mistaken for aristocratic charm for over half a century. She was the smiling matriarch who refused to flee London during the Blitz, waving from palace windows like a porcelain figurine untouched by fear or doubt. To the world, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, embodied British resilience, the woman who outlived nearly everyone she'd ever known, with a grin that seemed almost supernatural in its persistence. But behind that carefully maintained facade of gin and smiles was a quieter truth that polite society was never meant to acknowledge. She drank, not scandalously or ruinously, but with the kind of refined consistency that transforms habit into ritual. Her beverage of choice was a specific concoction, gin and dubonnet in equal parts, garnished with 2 slices of lemon with the rind carefully preserved. This wasn't some hastily mixed cocktail, grabbed during moments of stress. It was a precisely calibrated elixir, mixed by palace staff multiple times throughout each day, reportedly beginning before lunch and continuing well into the evening hours. This represented no raucous party girl narrative. This was British aristocracy's version of controlled release, elegant and refined, never publicly discussed. The key lay in that silence. For decades, the Queen Mother's drinking was folded seamlessly into the broader mythology of her indomitable spirit. Her fondness for refreshment was treated with the kind of affectionate euphemism reserved for beloved relatives. Her daily tipple, a little something to maintain her energy. Biographers writing during her lifetime approached the subject with surgical delicacy, as if revealing too much might somehow destabilize the national equilibrium. But palace insiders told a more nuanced story. Former staff members, speaking only after retirement and always with careful phrasing, noted that her days were punctuated by alcohol, with the same regularity others might schedule afternoon tea. One former footman remarked that the drinks tray appeared as reliably as the schedule for walking the royal corgis. Another attendant, quoted anonymously years later, described the palace as operating on ritual, and cocktails formed an integral part of that sacred routine. Still, no one ever suggested she was out of control. That wasn't the point of her story. Her relationship with alcohol was quiet, measured, and in its own sophisticated way, inevitable. This wasn't excess in any classical sense. It was endurance, a way of managing the unbearable weight of expectation that came with being the last living link to an empire that no longer existed. The Queen Mother had survived 2 world wars, her husband's death, the abdication crisis that nearly destroyed the monarchy, and the gradual dismantling of everything she had been raised to believe was permanent. Throughout all of it, she had maintained perfect posture, kept her hats tilted at precisely the right angle, sustained that famous smile through decades of upheaval. If that performance required a few glasses of fortified spirits before dinner, well, that remained strictly her business, and the business of absolutely no one else. What proves most fascinating and perhaps unsettling is how thoroughly this dependency became normalized within the royal ecosystem. It never generated headlines or sparked concerned interventions. The royal publicity machine had already cast her as utterly untouchable. The Queen Mother, the last empress, the nation's beloved grandmother. In that carefully constructed version of reality, Jin wasn't a crutch or a weakness. It was simply another charming character detail, like her fondness for pastel colours or her legendary stubbornness about modern technology. But the habit remained real, and so did its quiet influence over her daily rhythms. While her public image stayed pristine and untouchable, her daughter Princess Margaret would not enjoy the same luxury of concealment. Where the Queen Mother's drinking was wrapped in nostalgia and respectability, Margaret's would be draped in scandal, cigarette smoke, and the slow unravelling of a woman desperately trying to outrun her own carefully constructed legend. If the Queen Mother drifted through royal life on a cloud of debonair and discretion, Princess Margaret crashed through it with a martini in one hand and a cigarette permanently attached to the other. Or at least that's how the tabloid newspapers chose to frame her story. She embodied everything her sister Queen Elizabeth II was not: glamorous, defiant, impulsive, deeply emotional, magnetically unpredictable. But beneath the shimmering surface of tiaras and Caribbean getaways was a woman quietly coming apart under the weight of the very stage she had been born onto. Her addictions to alcohol, cigarettes, prescription medications, and perhaps most destructively, to being constantly observed and admired, were less hidden than simply tolerated by a system that had grown comfortable with her controlled chaos. Until suddenly they weren't tolerable anymore. Margaret occupied the impossible position of younger sister, the spare heir, a role she seemed to simultaneously resent and embrace with equal fervour. Her entire life unfolded in the gilded echo chamber of her sister's destiny. She would never wear the crown, but she would always remain undeniably royal. She played this contradictory role with unmistakable flair, smoking in public when ladies simply didn't smoke, dancing in nightclubs, when royals maintained dignified distance, wearing crimson nail polish, during an era when red signified open rebellion. She transformed routine state events into something resembling high-fashion editorials that had accidentally wandered into Westminster Abbey. By all contemporary accounts, she was magnetically charismatic, but that magnetism extracted a steep price. The relentless expectation to perform, coupled with equally relentless scrutiny when she inevitably faltered, created an impossible psychological trap. Margaret's dependence on alcohol didn't begin with dramatic collapse or public humiliation. It started with ritual, the same way most royal addictions quietly took root: a whiskey before lunch, wine accompanying meals, port or brandy afterward. Over time, those social rituals hardened into inflexible routine, and that routine gradually assumed control over her daily existence. Friends and former staff members later recalled how her legendary sharp wit would slowly fade as each day progressed, replaced by slurred speech, icy mood swings, and extended periods of impenetrable silence. What had once been Margaret simply being Margaret gradually transformed into something far more tragic. Margaret disappearing inside herself, one glass at a time. Her cigarette consumption proved equally relentless and far more visible to public observation. She reportedly smoked up to 60 cigarettes daily for decades, a staggering amount that would challenge even the most dedicated nicotine addicts. When the pressures of royal obligations mounted, or when elaborate parties ended and guests departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts, there were always pills available to smooth the transition between artificial highs and crushing lows. Sedatives, tranquilizers, sleeping aids, all perfectly legal, all properly prescribed, all seamlessly integrated into the performance of being Princess Margaret. The palace initially tried to maintain appearances, as it always did. For years, Margaret's drinking was dismissed as charming eccentricity, her smoking as a generational quirk that would eventually resolve itself. The public witnessed the laughter, the lavish holidays, the scandalous romances that kept tabloid editors in business for decades. They never saw the private collapses behind closed doors, the missed appointments that had to be quietly rescheduled, the days spent confined to bed with curtains drawn against a world that demanded constant sparkle and perpetual availability. Even after suffering a series of strokes during the 1990s, official language remained diplomatically vague. Health complications, mobility issues, the need for extended rest. Few public statements mentioned the long history of physical deterioration that had become impossible to ignore by anyone paying close attention. When Margaret died in 2002 at age 71, she appeared far older than her chronological years, visibly diminished from the rebellious sparkle that had once defined her public persona. Her legacy remains beautifully complicated, a woman simultaneously trapped and defined by her royal title, who burned brilliantly, lived dangerously, and ultimately faced her final years largely alone. But her story wasn't unique within the long sweep of royal history, not even remotely close. Because nearly 400 years earlier, another monarch, far more powerful and infinitely more feared, had also lost himself to compulsive consumption. Not cocktails and tabloid scandals, but medieval feasts and primitive opiates wrapped in myths of absolute majesty that made his eventual downfall appear even more monstrous. Long before Buckingham Palace employed press secretaries, before the House of Windsor mastered the delicate art of damage control, and before addiction became something quietly managed behind velvet curtains, there ruled Henry VIII. A monarch who required no concealment because his absolute power made objective truth entirely optional. He remains England's most infamous king, a force of nature who acquired 6 wives, maintained an appetite for supreme authority, and developed a waistline that expanded in direct proportion to his political control. Publicly, he represented strength incarnate, divine right made flesh. Privately, he was a man whose body was systematically breaking down, kept functional only through compulsive eating, wine-soaked excess, and early forms of pain relief that modern medicine would immediately recognize as narcotic dependence. In his youth, Henry had been genuinely athletic, magnetically charismatic, a Renaissance poster child who wielded jousting lances with the same confidence he applied to Latin scholarship. But by middle age, he had transformed into something far more troubling. Morbidly obese, barely mobile, suffering from a catalogue of health problems that reads like a medical textbook. Chronic leg ulcers that festered and stank, persistent insomnia, debilitating gout, mood swings so extreme they made court attendance a daily gamble with potential execution. To manage this cascade of physical and psychological agony, Henry relied on what his court physicians diplomatically termed soothing tonics. These weren't gentle herbal teas or harmless folk remedies. They were crude but effective precursors to modern opiates, tinctures derived from poppy plants, extracts of mandrake root, even experimental compounds laced with mercury that promised relief from suffering while slowly poisoning the patient. These substances dulled the excruciating pain in his legs, which had turned septic and developed such a horrific odour that even loyal courtiers struggled to remain in his presence during private audiences. They helped regulate his erratic sleep patterns, calmed his increasingly paranoid rages, and provided temporary escape from the mounting pressures of ruling an empire while inhabiting a body that was actively rebelling against his authority. Food became another form of medication, elaborate feasts that functioned as therapeutic rituals rather than mere sustenance. Tables literally buckled under the weight of pies, roasted meats, and sweet wines, as if culinary abundance could somehow smother the reality of physical decay and psychological torment. His official portraits, famously idealized by court painters who understood the consequences of honest representation, show a king towering in armor, resolute and commanding. The truth proved far less flattering and infinitely more human. By the 1540s, Henry required mechanical assistance to lift his massive body into bed each night, yet no one dared speak openly of dependence or addiction. Such concepts didn't exist in 16th century vocabulary, especially not when applied to kings who ruled by divine appointment. If Henry demanded wine with breakfast and opium-laced cordials with dinner, these requests were treated not as evidence of weakness, but as royal prerogative. Even his personal physicians, who privately documented his worsening condition in coded language, couched their observations in careful euphemism. The king requires his tincture for proper rest. His Majesty finds the cordial beneficial for his humours. It represented loyalty through strategic omission, medical care filtered through political necessity. Modern historians, poring over surviving court records and medical documentation, have slowly reconstructed what no one dared name during Henry's lifetime. The king was essentially medicating himself into basic functionality, using the primitive pharmaceuticals available in his era to maintain some semblance of royal authority, while his body and mind gradually deteriorated. His legendary volatility, the sudden executions, the explosive rages, the seemingly random religious reversals that reshaped English society, these may have been less divine inspiration and more chemical fluctuation. A monarch simultaneously enabled and eroded by the very substances meant to preserve his ability to govern, and yet, even as his physical form failed him catastrophically, the myth endured with remarkable resilience. Royal power insulated him from scrutiny, and historical time polished his reputation into something approaching legend. The bloated, medicated, pain-ridden man became, in collective memory, a colossus in armour, a titan who reshaped England through sheer force of will. But Henry wasn't the only monarch to weaponize contradiction so effectively. Just a century later, another king would publicly condemn a particular vice from religious pulpits, while quietly indulging that same weakness in private, until the boundary between moral crusade and personal hypocrisy vanished entirely in clouds of aromatic smoke. In 1604, King James I published what would become the most scathing anti-smoking manifesto of the early modern era. A counterblast to tobacco wasn't merely criticism, it was literary warfare, describing the habit as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. The rhetoric was so fierce, so morally absolute, that it left no doubt about where this particular monarch stood on the creeping threat of tobacco consumption. And yet, as so often happens in the shadowed corridors of royal life, the official story was considerably more complicated than the published proclamation suggested. While James may have penned history's most famous anti-smoking treatise, evidence suggests his relationship with tobacco was far more nuanced than his public condemnation indicated. In his younger years, long before England's throne had been handed to him like an unwanted inheritance, James VI of Scotland moved through court circles where smoking was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged as sophisticated social ritual. Tobacco, then an expensive luxury imported from Spanish and Portuguese colonies, was offered in ornate pipes during elite gatherings, treated as both medicine and exotic indulgence. Early correspondence from Scottish courtiers hints at a young James who participated with apparent enthusiasm during social functions, especially throughout the 1580s, when tobacco retained its mystique as a fashionable novelty among European aristocracy. Later in life, once he had inherited the crowns of both Scotland and England, James underwent what can only be described as a complete philosophical transformation. The anti-tobacco essay formed part of a broader campaign to establish himself as the moral shepherd of his subjects, a ruler who stood above vice, above hypocrisy, and certainly above the growing trend of smoky tavern indulgences that were, in his reformed view, corrupting the moral fabric of society. The published text itself reads like theatrical performance, drawing elaborate comparisons between tobacco smoke and what he memorably described as the horrible stink of hell itself. Yet within court walls, the king's actual relationship with the substance remained far less definitive than his public rhetoric suggested. Several historians believe his aggressive anti-tobacco stance originated not from pure moral principle, but from personal frustration, possibly rooted in his own early experimentation with smoking. While no direct evidence confirms James as a lifelong smoker, multiple contemporary sources, including Spanish diplomatic correspondence and French court gossip, refer obliquely to habits abandoned in youth. One particularly revealing account from a visiting ambassador suggested the king's frequent condemnation of smoking seemed rehearsed, as if designed to convince himself as much as his audience. The intensity of his public opposition, some observers noted, felt disproportionate to the actual threat tobacco posed to his kingdom. Whether James was truly addicted or merely experimented and recoiled in horror remains historically unclear. But what seems certain is that he spent much of his reign policing not just his subjects' behaviour, but his own carefully constructed image. His fierce anti-smoking campaign conveniently aligned with his economic interests, allowing him to impose heavy taxes on imported tobacco while simultaneously condemning its use. This represented royal sleight of hand at its most sophisticated, policy that appeared virtuous but functioned primarily as revenue generation. What makes James's story resonate across centuries isn't whether he smoked in secret or simply flirted with the habit in youth. It's that his need to publicly disavow tobacco so loudly, so aggressively, and in such elaborate published form reveals the profound tension between private self and performative monarchy. This same tension would echo through the centuries in another royal figure, one who faced the devastating losses of war and personal tragedy, not with public speeches or moral campaigns, but with gentle sedatives that helped steady trembling hands while the world praised her as Britain's last great queen. Queen Anne understood suffering in ways that most monarchs mercifully never experience. She was never accused of sentimentality or emotional display, her public image ironed flat into the rigid silhouette of early 18th century protocol. Cold, composed, endlessly dignified. She was the woman who corrected grammar mid-conversation, catalogued royal porcelain by historical period, and once instructed a fainting lady-in-waiting to stand still and think like a duchess when composure seemed to be failing. But beneath that unwavering exterior were cracks that ran deeper than any public ceremony could conceal. And into those fractures crept something the nation never witnessed: a quiet reliance on alcohol that helped her survive the two most psychologically devastating chapters of her reign: the War of Spanish Succession and the crushing weight of personal loss that would have broken a less determined spirit. It's difficult to overstate the psychological toll that early 18th century politics inflicted on the monarchy. Queen Anne wasn't just a symbol of imperial endurance, she was expected to embody that endurance while simultaneously grieving losses that would have destroyed ordinary people. She lost 17 children through miscarriages, stillbirths, and early deaths. That isn't a statistic to be noted and forgotten. It represents persistent trauma compounded by chronic physical ailments that left her barely able to walk in her final years. She suffered from debilitating gout and what court physicians vaguely labelled as dropsy, a term encompassing everything from heart failure to severe edema that left her swollen and in constant pain. Yet through all of this, she was expected to appear regal, strong, completely in command of both herself and her troubled kingdom. Like so many royals before and after her, she discovered a private remedy that allowed her to function despite unbearable circumstances. For decades, royal staff and court physicians maintained meticulous silence around Queen Anne's health, treating her composure as something too sacred for discussion. But documents and private correspondence that surfaced years after her death paint a more complete portrait of a woman whose doctors quietly prescribed barbiturates to manage anxiety, restlessness, and the creeping exhaustion that comes from perpetual performance under impossible conditions. These early sedatives, the dominant calming agents of the early 18th century, were commonly used to induce sleep, settle nerves, and in Queen Anne's specific case, sustain public function when private suffering threatened to overwhelm her capacity for royal duty. Court staff referred to her restorative drops and evening elixirs with the kind of diplomatic language that concealed as much as it revealed. One court physician, in correspondence never intended for publication, noted that the Queen's evening tonics were of the strengthening kind, though he added the careful qualifier, laced discreetly. Those closest to her understood the reality behind the euphemisms. Her ladies-in-waiting sometimes discovered her sleeping during afternoon hours, having excused herself from scheduled meetings with complaints of headaches that everyone politely accepted without question. Government ministers spoke in hushed tones about her increasingly withdrawn temperament and what they diplomatically termed mental fatigue. Her correspondence, especially her famously complicated relationship with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, took on an increasingly erratic quality that some historians attribute to the combined effects of physical pain, prescribed medication, and wine. The political demands of her era required a stoic monarch capable of weathering any crisis without visible emotion. Anne tried desperately to comply with these expectations. She attended religious services with unwavering dedication, sponsored theological scholarship, and avoided the flamboyant excesses that had tainted previous rulers' reputations. But behind the carefully maintained facade, reality proved far more intimate and infinitely more human. Alcohol wasn't her rebellion against royal constraint. It was her quiet companion, a way to manage the unbearable intersection of grief, expectation, and physical decline. In an era before effective antidepressants or modern pain management, wine often provided the only available relief that didn't involve medieval practices like bloodletting or the application of leeches. Unlike her successors, Anne didn't benefit from modern palace public relations machinery. Yet, even without sophisticated media management, the court proved remarkably effective at protecting her image. When she missed public engagements, official statements cited her well-documented physical ailments. When she appeared unsteady or spoke with less than perfect clarity, observers attributed these signs to fever or the effects of her chronic swelling. No mention was ever made of the glasses of brandy that may have steadied her hands or blurred the world just enough to make another state meeting survivable. Anne died at age 49, exhausted, bloated, and heavily medicated, both by her physicians and her own careful self-treatment. Official records listed the cause as complications from gout and dropsy, but behind that clinical diagnosis lay a life spent managing constant pain with the kind of quiet dependence that royal protocol would never permit anyone to acknowledge openly. And yet Anne wasn't the first royal to hide vulnerability behind ritualized excess. Just a generation before her troubled reign, another monarch known for his libertine charm had developed his own nightly ritual, one laced not only with pleasure, but with tonics, powders, and the medicinal poisons that 17th century apothecaries sold with reassuring confidence. King Charles II earned the title of Merry Monarch through decades of carefully cultivated revelry, but that merriment was never as effortless as it appeared. Behind the endless parties, countless mistresses, and candlelit masquerades lay a restless energy that never quite found peace, sustained by a daily chemical regimen designed to maintain the illusion of effortless royal vitality. Charles didn't simply indulge in the pleasures available to 17th century royalty. He relied on a steady stream of period tonics and elixirs, many laced with opium, mercury, and other early narcotics, to mask the growing physical cost of a life lived at perpetually unsustainable intensity. To his admirers, Charles represented the charming king who restored joy to English court life after the grim austerity of Puritan rule. He reintroduced music, theatre, fashion, and sophisticated flirtation into the cultural bloodstream of Restoration Britain. But to his numerous physicians, he was a patient of mounting contradictions, athletic and energetic during daylight hours, yet plagued by insomnia and trembling fatigue when darkness fell. His solution involved what court apothecaries marketed as medicinal cordials, sold in gold-trimmed bottles with reassuring names like the King's Strengthening Draught and Sovereign Water of Life. But beneath the poetic branding were ingredients that modern toxicologists would recognize as highly addictive compounds designed to artificially sustain energy while creating deeper dependence. Records from Charles's personal apothecaries reveal an astonishing pharmaceutical arsenal. Tinctures containing laudanum, an opium derivative that promised relief from everything. Tonics featuring powdered pearls and bezoars, exotic substances believed to counteract poison while providing mysterious vitality. Nightly restoratives laced with compounds that would make contemporary addiction specialists recoil in horror. These weren't casual comfort aids or occasional indulgences. They formed the backbone of his daily routine, part placebo, part poison, part absolutely necessary coping mechanism for a king trying to maintain impossible standards of royal performance. While Charles rarely showed weakness during public appearances, his private correspondence with court physicians tells a dramatically different story. Persistent headaches, chronic fatigue, chest tightness, periods of profound melancholy, and occasional paralysis in his extremities. His health problems weren't always visible to courtiers and subjects, but they were constant, and they were treated with the full chemical arsenal that Restoration-era medicine could provide. His dependence on medicinal stimulants and sedatives wasn't particularly unusual among 17th century aristocracy. What made Charles unique was how seamlessly this chemical support system was woven into his carefully constructed public image. While his father, Charles I, had been remembered as solemn and ultimately tragic, Charles II reinvented monarchy as an ongoing celebration of life itself. He threw elaborate balls during constitutional crises. He made jokes during tense parliamentary debates. He maintained his reputation as a tireless lover and patron of arts even when his body began showing signs of serious rebellion. When physical decline threatened his performance, he simply increased the dosage and continued the show. The supreme irony of his reign was that many of the same physicians who supplied these chemical supports would later scramble desperately to save him from their long-term effects. In his final weeks, Charles suffered what was officially described as a sudden illness, likely a stroke that may have been worsened by decades of strain and substance exposure. Royal physicians bled him, purged him, blistered his skin, and dosed him with additional compounds in a full spectrum of 17th century treatments that read now like a slow-motion medical disaster. Contemporary accounts suggest he died surrounded by alchemists and astrologers, with jars of powdered amber and opium tinctures within easy reach. To the public, he remained the merry monarch until his final breath, generous, charming, and gone far too soon. The carefully managed rituals of medicine had been successfully disguised as natural vitality, and the gradual breakdown occurring beneath the crown was never fully revealed to his subjects. Still, Charles wasn't the only royal to masterfully balance both personal vice and public image. One of his own nephews would inherit not just political power, but also a dangerous appetite for risk. A man whose gambling debts were quietly forgiven by Parliament, whose nightly excesses were diplomatically edited from official records, and whose various addictions left far more than just financial receipts in their wake. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, may be immortalized in nursery rhymes as the general who marched his men up the hill only to march them down again. But his real legacy runs far deeper and considerably darker than children's verses suggest. He was King George III's second son, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, and the architect of military reforms that shaped Britain's defence capabilities for generations. He was also, behind closed palace doors, a compulsive gambler and heavy drinker whose appetite for risk extended far beyond battlefield strategy into the treacherous realm of cards, dice, and expensive wine. To the British public, Frederick embodied military respectability, calm under pressure, strategically competent, disciplined in all his official duties. But behind the scenes, he harboured a weakness for gambling that went far beyond the casual card games common among Georgian aristocracy. Frederick played with the desperate intensity of a man trying to fill some indefinable void, often losing sums that would have bankrupted lesser mortals. Of course, bankruptcy is a relative concept when you're funded by British taxpayers and shielded by the impenetrable armour of royal privilege. Still, his debts accumulated with terrifying speed. Contemporary correspondence from increasingly anxious creditors, intercepted court documents, and whispered conversations among fellow officers reveal a man living in perpetual financial freefall, borrowing frequently, repaying slowly, and requiring direct parliamentary intervention on more than one occasion to prevent complete financial collapse. Not publicly, naturally. Such interventions happened behind carefully closed doors through delicate negotiations and strategically worded financial rearrangements. Royal dignity demanded preservation, even when drowning in debt accumulated through compulsive self-destruction. The alcohol didn't help his decision-making process. Frederick's relationship with drink wasn't particularly scandalous by 18th century aristocratic standards, but it was remarkably consistent, bordering on ritualistic dependency. He drank to celebrate victories, to forget defeats, to prepare for difficult meetings, often continuing well past midnight after exhausting evenings of gambling or demanding court engagements. Friends who survived him later noted his visibly declining health and increasingly frequent absences from official duties, but loyalty prevented honest discussion. The Duke was, after all, royal blood. His habits weren't treated as dangerous problems requiring intervention. They were simply accepted as colourful personality traits that added character to his otherwise distinguished military service. The carefully maintained facade occasionally cracked under pressure. One of the most public fractures came during the Mary Ann Clark scandal, a widely publicised affair in which Frederick's former mistress was accused of illegally selling army commissions, allegedly with his knowledge, or at least his willful blindness, to her activities. The scandal nearly destroyed his carefully constructed reputation. Though he vehemently denied any involvement, the press seized the opportunity to dissect his private life with unprecedented scrutiny. He was temporarily forced to resign his military position while investigations proceeded. His gambling and drinking habits were never cited directly as contributing factors, but biographers have long noted how his personal chaos may have made him more vulnerable to manipulation by those with sharper instincts and fewer scruples. Despite the temporary disgrace, Frederick eventually returned to public service and died with his military reputation largely restored. History chooses to remember him as the army reformer, the dedicated royal uncle, the man who professionalised British defence systems and prepared the nation for the conflicts that would define the 19th century. His private dependencies were carefully edited from official records like footnotes no one dared read aloud. But Frederick's story, like so many royal narratives, serves as a reminder that beneath every uniform and ceremonial title lived a human being, struggling, often unsuccessfully, to manage pressures that would have crushed ordinary mortals. Just as Frederick reached for wine and cards to navigate the impossible demands of royal military service, another monarch, ruling a vast empire from behind the black veil of perpetual mourning, reached for something far more potent. A chemical solution to grief and numbness, carefully packaged in dark bottles labelled with reassuring medical terminology. Queen Victoria ruled for over 60 years, presiding over an empire so geographically vast that the sun literally never set on British territories. She became the living embodiment of dutiful widowhood, national stability, and imperial resolve that seemed to transcend ordinary human limitations. But beneath the jet-black mourning dresses and austere public proclamations was a woman quietly medicating herself through decades of grief that would have shattered anyone less determined to maintain appearances. To understand her hidden dependency, one must first comprehend the magnitude of her loss. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria didn't simply enter mourning in the performative royal sense. She underwent a complete psychological retreat from the world of the living. She wore unrelenting black for the remaining 40 years of her life, withdrew almost entirely from public appearances for several years, and instructed palace staff to maintain Albert's private rooms exactly as he had left them, as if he might return at any moment. And so we reach the end of our journey through the shadowed halls of royal dependency, where crowns couldn't cure human frailty and divine right offered no protection against the quiet demons that lurked behind palace walls. From George IV's laudanum-soaked evenings to Victoria's grief-numbed solitude, these 30 souls remind us that even those born to rule were never immune to the need for relief, for escape, for something to make the unbearable weight of expectation just a little more manageable. Perhaps that's the most human truth of all, that behind every carefully constructed facade, every airbrushed portrait, every perfectly choreographed public appearance, there lived people who simply needed help getting through another day. Sweet dreams, and may your own rest be more peaceful than theirs ever was.